Hey guys, Kendra here. Welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be talking about the second set of 50 pages, so from like 148 to 103 in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And I'm really excited to talk about this one today. I'm struggling with my words today, so just bear with me. Hopefully I will edit out all the worst of it, but we're just gonna go with it. So as a little recap, last time we left Clarissa in her sitting room mending a green dress, and Peter Walsh left. And we talked a little bit about the intro stuff last time and about how we were focusing on the relationships in Mrs. Dalloway for the most part this time through. There's so much you could do, but you only have so much time. So if you haven't already seen the first part of this series, you'll definitely want to go check it out because that will set up this section for you. Also, for those of you following along, there are going to be spoilers because this is a walkthrough, but this is just to help people who want to get into this novel and had struggles or just want to get more out of it. Last time, we talked about how Clarissa and Septimus Warren Smith are doubles of each other. In the intro to the 1928 edition of Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf talked about that and how she wanted to write the same essence kind of expressed in two different ways. My words, not hers. So a lot of people focus on Septimus because it really tackles mental health in a very vivid way, a very meaningful way. So Virginia Woolf first suffered with mental health herself, and so that was just something that was just so incredibly well done, those sections. But we'll get there. First, we have to look at Peter. And as you know, Peter and I, we have a complex relationship. I get irritated by him almost more than any other character in this book because of reasons, and we'll get there. But a lot of you were very sympathetic to him, which is understandable. So I decided to do a little more research about Peter before I headed into the second 50 pages, and I found some great resources. But I found an essay that talked about the societal critiques in this book. The author of the essay mentioned that most people focus on the inner conscious lives, and in fact Francine Prose believes that is the core of this novel, but the author of the essay I was reading said that by ignoring the social critiques that Virginia Woolf was putting into Mrs. Dalloway, you're ignoring a huge section of the purpose. And I would agree with that. Virginia Woolf very much was critiquing society and societal expectations. In fact, that's what I want to talk about a little bit before we move forward. So the essay I read really got my brain spinning, and it was talking about how Richard Dalloway, Clarissa's husband, is the ideal patriarchal male. And Peter is in conflict with himself. He's very indecisive. And so by rubbing the knife over and over, he's expressing a sense of indecisiveness and anxiety about his own masculinity. As we noted, he's a very emotional man, which was not considered the ideal masculine trait at the time, and so he just feels that anxiety. And I think you could argue then that Clarissa on the outside is the ideal society woman, that she is the ideal feminine woman, and then Sally is the equivalent of Peter, and she's very masculine. She smokes cigars, she's very outspoken, very loud, and I think that you could have those parallels there in this book, which I think if you take that and you move forward as we're going to, that it makes a lot of sense what Virginia Woolf is doing. She really wanted to critique the way that society viewed men and women in a rule zone. She famously said men and women should be man womanly and woman manly, that women and men are both allowed to be courageous and strong, but also sensitive and caring. And whatever gender you are should not determine your traits. So I love that about Virginia Woolf, and so that's what we're going to look through moving forward a little bit. Also the relationships. And I'm just gesturing wildly at this point because I'm so excited. So we're just going to start before I knock something over again. All right, so we left with Clarissa being very questioning about her life and the choices that she made. Think midlife crisis, Where am I now? What decisions could I have made? I don't know. And so you could see when Peter's visiting her, she says at the top of page 47, "If I had married him, this gaiety would have been mine all day. No, not that I would have been with the love of my life. No, that I would feel happy," because we know that she's struggling to feel. She's a sense of almost depression and not wanting to admit that. So we move to page 48. I have, again, this edition, so I'm going to be calling out those numbers, that we see this now, a parallel with Clarissa's journey through London. We're getting Peter's journey through London and also his flashbacks, like Clarissa had flashbacks. So it's almost the same type of situation, only Peter is leaving Clarissa's. And we see that, it's just so well done. So on page 49, we see how he's talking about how Clarissa is cold. And there was always something cold in Clarissa, he thought. Down the page, he had been emotional, told her everything as usual. He notes that he's very emotional. And there's a returning theme of him and his resentment towards his own emotional nature. We see that he used the word sentimental, that she had been a trifle sentimental. At the top of page 49, he's always accusing Sally and Clarissa of being sentimental. So you see he also mentions deep emotion on page 50, and that it is Clarissa herself, he thought, with a deep emotion, an extraordinary, clear yet puzzling recollection of her, as if the spell had come into the room years ago. And you see that she just has so much passion for his thoughts of Clarissa. Now, of course, we know with Clarissa, the passion she felt in her own flashbacks or memories was for Sally Seton. So we see that when Clarissa's thinking of her first love, she's thinking of Sally, and Peter is thinking of Clarissa. Lovely little love triangle they have going on. And then with Richard, I guess it's a love square. I don't really know. So he's going through the street and he's thinking about Clarissa and he's thinking about his life. Then we see on page 52, direction of the Haymarket came a young woman who, as she passed Gordon's statue, seemed, Peter Walsh thought, susceptible as he was, to shed veil after veil until she became the very woman he had always had in mind, young, but stately, merry, but discreet, black but enchanting. Straightening himself and stealthily fingering his pocket knife, he started after her to follow this woman, this excitement. And so he follows her, and if you move down the page, you can see his own fantasy come to life, and this idea that she's this beautiful, ideal woman that he has had in his mind, and that she is what he needs, that he has yet to achieve. And personally, I feel like him viewing Clarissa as this ideal woman that he wanted, almost in a possessive sense, that was his fantasy, of what he wanted. And he has these little images of what this woman would say and do, and it says, she moved, she crossed, he followed her. To embarrass her was the last thing he wished. Still, if she had stopped, he would say, come and have an ice, he would say, and she would answer perfectly simply, oh yes. And it says here, but other people got between them in the street, obstructing him, blotting her out. He pursued. She changed. And I think this is just an example of the way that he views women. So while he is not as maybe the patriarchal idea as Richard, he still is very much masculine in the sense of how he views women. We saw how he barged past Lucy the maid. We're going to see how he treats an older woman in the street a few pages down from where we are. And we see how he views Clarissa and how he views Sally. And just how he views them through this lens of this masculine view of women. And we can see what that view of women is when Clarissa was walking through the street saying that she is already married, she's given birth, what left is for her as a woman. She's done what society expected to her. What is her life now? And that kind of starts her whole journey of questioning the life that she has. We see another contradiction here on the page bottom of 55. Yes, as a child, he walked in Regent's Park. Odd, he thought. How the thought of childhood keeps coming back to me. The result of seeing Clarissa, perhaps. For women live much more in the past than we do, he thought. They attach themselves to places. And their fathers. A woman's always proud of her father. And he's sitting in Regent Park and he's looking around. But we know from all these flashbacks that he's also living the past just as much as the women that he claims are so different from him. And just the irony of that. So we go forward to page 59 and we see his flashback of Borton in summer. And there's an instance where a guy marries this maid because he gets her pregnant. And so Sally mentions this and it shocks Clarissa. And Peter says he hadn't blamed her for minding the fact, since in those days a girl brought up as she was knew nothing, but it was her manner that annoyed him. Timid, hard, something arrogant, unimaginative, prudish. The death of the soul, he said that instinctively, ticketing the moment as he used to do. The death of her soul. Okay, man. But Clarissa also mentioned that she was kind of shocked because she hadn't been taught of anything at the time. So I find it interesting that now that we've seen Clarissa's view, we're now getting Peter's. And I think it's important to note, because we're so embedded in the consciousness of each of these characters, that they're all very unreliable. And we almost have to like be a jury and see them each present their view of the story and kind of decide for ourselves what we believe to be true. And I think what we decide as readers says something about ourselves as people, and as we move forward. So I just always love unreliable narrators, but we can see a lot of that unreliable narration here on page 59 and through 60. There's an instance where after this they talk about the woman getting pregnant, that Clarissa throws herself on this dog, and it says she went into raptures. It was as if she said to Peter, it was all aimed at him, he knew. I know you thought me absurd about the woman just now, but see how extraordinary sympathetic I am? See how I love my Rom? So what actually happened that we know is that she threw herself on this shaggy dog. In his head, she said, I know you thought me absurd about that woman just now. He feels that she is communicating with him. And it says the next line, they had always had a queer power of communicating without words. Did she actually mean to communicate with Peter? Was she communicating with Sally? I don't know. She could have been communicating with Peter, but we don't know. I think that because we've already seen a history of his little fantasy life, him following that woman, that we need to take all of his opinions here and his interpretation of events with a grain of salt, because if he has had that fantasy about a woman he's barely known, then what kind of fantasies did he have around Clarissa? That's just a personal thing for me. I haven't actually read too much about that, but I always think Peter just struggles, man. He just struggles so much. And it says that he always saw through Clarissa, and I don't. He didn't even know it. We never see him talking about Clarissa and Sally being in love. I'm pretty sure he missed something there. And it talks about how much he loved her, and then when Mr. Dalloway comes on the scene, he says, she will marry that man. He says it again a few pages later, she will marry that man. Page 63 again. So Sally also, we see, doesn't really like him either. Obvious reasons. She loves Clarissa. And then one time after Clarissa starts dating Mr. Dalloway, we see that Peter says to Clarissa, the perfect hostess, he said to her, whereupon she winced all over, but he meant her to feel it. He would have done anything to hurt her after seeing her with Dalloway. And we see that jealousy. Clarissa mentions the jealousy when she and Sally have kissed in the field or somewhere near flowers, I'm not exactly sure, and Peter comes barging in and she talks about his jealousy. And we see that there's a lot of images of Mr. Dalloway here in his memories of being this ideal masculine man, and he even says that Mr. Dalloway deserved Clarissa. And then he says for himself he was observed. His demands upon Clarissa, he could see it now, referring to Peter's own demands, were absurd. He asked impossible things. He made terrible scenes. She would have accepted him still, perhaps, if he had been less absurd. Sally thought so. Sally wrote him all that summer long letters, how they had talked of him, how she had praised him, how Clarissa burst into tears. And you can see this weird, complex love shape happening right here, how Peter is thinking, what could he have done to win Clarissa away from Richard? But the fact is, I think that because he is not this masculine, traditionally masculine man, that he's not going to get this ideal woman. There's no room in this type of society for a man who has emotions, perhaps like a woman would, to have the ideal feminine woman. It's sort of like the best man gets the best woman, that kind of deal, almost like a competition. And I think that's very interesting as she moves through that. I still think Peter's very possessive, but it's almost as like his love for her was doomed before he even started because of societal expectations. We see this entire really dramatic breakup scene where she tells him they'll never work out. She says earlier in the book, as we know, that they would have destroyed each other. On page 65, we move to Septimus. Now here is mainly where we get the idea of where Septimus is at, because Peter's also sitting in Regent Park. We move across in that stream of consciousness way over to Lucrezia Warren Smith and her husband, Septimus Warren Smith. We know that he, Septimus, has come back from war. Now, Virginia Woolf hated war. She was a pacifist, I think primarily because her brother died while serving in the military, and she thought that people generally thought that war was the most masculine thing a person could do, and that it was considered the most important. And I read a quote last week that, how we tend to think that war is really important, but going to shops and things like a woman would traditionally do is not considered important because it's feminine. So moving on that, I think you can see why she chose a ex-military man to serve as the double of Clarissa, because he has done the most important thing as a man, and Clarissa, being a society woman, is doing the most important thing as a woman. And I think, according to society, you understand. So I think that she's doing a great job of paralleling that in here. On page 66, we see that Lucrezia Warren Smith really is struggling with her husband. She's not happy, and she's trying to figure out what's wrong with him. But yet, Dr. Holmes, who is their doctor, said that there was nothing the matter with him. What then had happened? Why had he gone then? Why? Why, when she sat by him, did he start, frown at her, move away, and point at her hand, take her hand, and look terrified? Then we move to Septimus Warren Smith, and in his head we see that he's really struggling. One of his friends, Evan, has died, and he's struggling with his PTSD. He's just seeing things that aren't there, and he's suffering. And we know that Virginia Woolf wanted to talk about this and talk about her own experience with struggles with mental health and how she saw things. There's a quote from Francine Prose that I'm going to read you. Francine Prose says, "Clearly writing on Septimus was painful for her, chillingly close to her own agonies. In one letter, she referred to the mad scenes, quote, 'It was a subject that I've kept cooling in my mind until I felt I could touch it without bursting into flame all over,' end quote." And I think that you can see these beautiful descriptions that she has that you would, I'm not sure how anyone could write them without having experienced them themselves. It's just so incredibly beautiful. She has just such talent. He describes his mental state as, "But he himself remained on a high rock, like a drowned sailor on a rock. I leant over the edge of the boat and fell down," he thought. "I went under the sea. I have been dead, and yet now I'm alive. But let me rest still," he begged. And there's this idea that he cannot rest because of the struggles that he's having with his PTSD and the memories that keep washing over him in waves. And you have that ocean imagery going through. Then we see one of the sections that I think is very important is that he is looking for beauty. And so he's sitting on a bench in Regent Park, and it says, "He had only to open his eyes, but a weight was on them, a fear. He strained, he pushed, he looked. He saw Regent's Park before him, long streamers of sunlight fawned at his feet. The trees waved, brandished. We welcomed, the world seemed to say. We accept, we create. Beauty, the world seemed to say. And so we have to prove it scientifically wherever he looked, at the houses, at the railings, at the antelopes, stretching over palings. Beauty sprang instantly." And it goes down the paragraph, continuing that beautiful description. And at the very end of the paragraph, it says, "It was the truth now. Beauty, that was the truth now. Beauty was everywhere." And the sense of beauty and the search for beauty recurs throughout Septimus's kind of like fever dreams that he has. Well, in the next section, we'll see that he's looking at Shakespeare, and he finds beauty in that as well. So we're going to up forward here, and on page 73, we're back in Peter's memories, and we get a little image of Sally's station in society. And it says, "Sally, to do her justice now, through all that, one of the things he remembered best was an argument one Sunday morning at Bourton about women's rights. As Sally suddenly lost her temper, flared up, and told Hugh that he represented all that was most detestable in the British middle-class life." A little farther down the page, "She did it on purpose," she said afterwards, "for they used to get together in the vegetable garden and compare notes. He's read nothing, thought nothing, felt nothing." And further down the page, "She was really spiteful for some reason, had some grudge against him. Something had happened. He forgot what. In the smoking room. He had insulted her, kissed her. Incredible. Nobody believed a word against Hugh, of course. Who could? Kissing Sally in the smoking room. If it had been some Honourable Edith or Lady Violet, perhaps, but not that ragamuffin Sally without a penny to her name." And we can see that no one believed her, that no one would believe her word against Hugh, that Sally was not of the equal station to many of the members that were there at Bourton at the time. And I just think that's very interesting, how Sally is, the more outspoken, masculine, traditionally masculine woman, and she is not living up to societal expectations. That's done really well. And I think as we move forward here, we see on page 75 that we have Clarissa becoming more attached to Dalloway, and he refers to Richard Dalloway getting on his hind legs, and Richard then said that no decent man ought to read Shakespeare sonnets because it was like listening at keyholes. Besides, the relationship was not one that he approved. I think it's interesting how many of the other characters read Shakespeare and love Shakespeare and talk about him in an intellectual way, a meeting of the minds, but Richard himself does not view reading poetry in that fashion. And it says on page 77 that these parties, for example, were all for him or for her idea of him. To do Richard justice, he would have been happier farming in Norfolk. She made her drawing room a sort of meeting place. She had a genius for it. He talks about how she uses her intellect to create social situations that would help Richard in his career, and just how she became the ideal woman, and that this girl who loved this meeting of the minds of Sally and reading and discussing intellectual things became the thing that society expected of her. On page 80 of Peter's section, and he talks about jealousy. He says, it was jealousy that was at the bottom of it, jealousy which survives every other passion of mankind. And then we go down and he talks about Clarissa and how she's tortured him, how she's so cold. And he says, but women, he thought, shedding his pocket knife, don't know what passion is. They don't know the meaning of it to men. Clarissa was as cold as an icicle. There she would sit on the sofa by his side, let him take her hand and give him one kiss. Here he was at the crossing. So we've seen Peter struggle through his jealousy and his desire to be with Clarissa, and he's jealous of both Sally and Richard Dalloway, but he feels so much emotion, and he feels that Clarissa is so cold. He believes that women cannot have passion, but we know, having seen from Clarissa's perspective, that she does feel passion, that she has passion for Sally. She just does not have passion for Peter. And so he makes this generalization about women and passion and their lack of emotion. And we go from there to this bridge where he meets this old crone type, this older lady who's singing in the street, and she represents like this whole oracle truth-telling kind of crone, as in like almost classic literature, going through and talking about her passion and her sexual passion for her partner. There's a lot of fertility images and different things, and so she's saying yes, women do have passion, but Peter is generally clueless. And his one bit in this entire section of her singing and talking about her life is Peter Walsh couldn't help but giving the poor creature a coin as he stepped out into his taxi. I think we could see the way that he treats women is very different from how he views Clarissa. If the women are not, I don't know, ideal, I think sometimes he just ignores them. So he bursts past Lucy, the maid, again, he follows the woman in the street, and then he thinks the poor old woman in the street, like that she hasn't had much of life, or is not much of life, when in fact she's had this brilliant life of passion and different things. And he's pretty clueless about women, and he buys into the whole patriarchal idea of women as an object to be on a pedestal. Now, he does genuinely love Clarissa, but I think that just adds to his complexity. It is an imperfect love, and Clarissa, I think, knows that. And I think that's why they never ended up together, personally. That's just my working theory. You can have a different working theory. That's fine. We're going to learn more about the relationship as we move to the second half of the book. Now, before I go, I want to talk about the section with Septimus and the two doctors. So for the sake of time, we're going to skip the section where he's thinking about art and reading. Just know that reading is of great importance to Septimus. It says he could not feel, he could reason, he could read. And he talks about how all the things that he's read and how that has been a great comfort to him. And how that reflects, I think, positively on his character. Eventually, we get to Dr. Holmes. His wife eventually gets him to see someone, and Dr. Holmes says, "There's nothing whatever the matter," said Dr. Holmes. He says that he brushed it all aside, headaches, sleeplessness, fears, dreams, nerve symptoms, and nothing more, he said. If Holmes found himself even a half pound below 11 stone 6, he asked his wife for another plate of porridge at breakfast. There is, as we know, a huge streak of people who believe that depression is a choice and that you can just think your way out of it. That you just think happy thoughts and your life is better. Like, that's all you do. You snap out of it, you go do something you enjoy. And that is illustrating one side of the medical community's view. And I think especially at the time it must have been more prevalent. Especially if you were a man, you know, you had gone to the war, you were a war hero, wanting to kill yourself was seen as cowardly. So to even admit that there was a problem would have been a big deal. And so Dr. Holmes isn't really helping, and so eventually they go see a second doctor, Sir William Bradshaw. Now at first when he comes on the scene you have hope because he does believe Septimus. He says it was a case of a complete breakdown, complete physical and nervous breakdown with every symptom in an advanced stage, and so you begin to feel hope. But then you hear that he wants to take Septimus away from his wife and from his family and from everything. It says that he thinks Septimus needs rest. He believes in proportion, so he believes order: rest in bed, rest in solitude, rest in silence, rest without friends, without books, without messages, 6 months rest, until a man who went in weighing 7 stone 6 comes out weighing 12. Worshipping in proportion, Sir William not only proposed himself, but made England prosper, secluded her lunatics, forbade childbirth, penalized despair, made it impossible for the unfit to propagate their views until they too shared his sense of proportion. His, if they were men, Lady Bradshaw's, if they were women. So we realize that that spark of hope has been dashed. He wants people to hold his view of what societal expectations are. And we see that because earlier in this section, he talks about his views on Dr. Holmes, and it says the fellow had made a distasteful impression, for there was in Sir William, whose father had been a tradesman, a natural respect for breeding and clothing, which shabbiness nettled. Again, more profoundly, there was in Sir William, who had never had the time for reading, a grudge deeply buried against cultivated people who came into his room and intimated that doctors, whose profession is a constant strain upon all the highest faculties, are not educated men. So we see people who want to uphold the societal standard tend not to read, which I find very interesting. So we also see going forth through this whole section of him going on about what he feels mental health is in this long discussion. So he believes that people should have a sense of proportion, but also there were moreover family affection, honor, courage, and a brilliant career, that everyone should strive for these things. And Virginia Woolf, I think, makes one of her harshest critiques on this particular doctor because she says that Sir William Bradshaw swooped, he devoured, he shut people up. It was this combination of decision and humanity that endeared Sir William so greatly to the relations of his victims. And I think by saying this, that she's pointing out that this is also not the correct way to go about things, and that it just can only do more harm than good. And I think that Virginia Woolf having such an experience in the mental health area is a great job. So hopefully all of that made sense. We are putting pieces together without seeing the full view of the puzzle yet. We're just halfway through, so stay with me. I hope you enjoyed that. And next time we're going to be looking at Mr. Dalloway and some of his ideals. I find this very interesting. I've loved learning more about Peter in particular. I just like him less this time around, but I will say I just want him to put his big girl panties on and understand that Clarissa is not an object to be owned. You know, that's just all I want from Peter, and we'll see at the end what happens. And I'm interested to see, having read all of these extra things this time, to see how that goes. So anyway, so before I go, we're going to be going to the break on 151. So that's another 50-ish pages, and then the last section is less than 50 pages. So all of the resources for the Goodreads discussion group, as well as everything for Reading Women Month, are going to be down in the description box below. So you'll want to go check that out, and I'll have some other information there as well. So until next time, I guess I'll see you next one. Bye guys.